And I'm showing 6:01, so I kind of gave myself around 6:02 that we would get started and jump right in, because John actually has a really a lot of information, a wealth of information, and he had to work hard to kind of pare it down and to focus in on things. Originally, we were talking about floods and droughts, but we're just at floods now, and that's what we're going to be focused on for this particular one. And whenever we get back to the drought cycle, we'll invite him back out, and he can cover the other half of his research. All right. Well, I think that it is 6:02, and I am really excited to get started and to get going with John here. So my name is Daniel Huecker. I'm the Field Institute Director for Sequoia Parks Conservancy. And Sequoia Parks Conservancy is the official nonprofit partner of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers at Lake Huecker. And what we do is we support these organizations in their different needs. We support them through different educational programs. We support them through communication and work with our own staff. And most importantly, we support them financially in a variety of ways, through fundraising, through in-kind donations, and through communicating with you, the public. So I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. This is a very current topic for those of you that live in California, but it's also, I think, a topic that is going to be relevant from wherever you're coming, because I think John really brings an interesting historical perspective to things that are going on in the world right now. The Giant Conversations series is really for having these kind of talks, and we try to do them on a somewhat frequent basis. It's been a few months since our last one, but we do have another one planned that we'll talk about at the end of this session on Pacific fishers, and we'll give you information on how you can join us if you're interested. But for this one, it is on the floods of the Huecker and the floods of the
whatever,
because we're talking about the rivers and that flow down into the lake basin. And joining us today is John Austn, and he is an author. He was a Southern farm boy who spent much of his life in the Rockies, and he's lived in the foothills of the Sierras most recently. And he has degrees in geology, forestry, and economics as well. And before retiring from the National Park Service in 2014, John spent over 41 years working for the Park Service as social scientist, as a natural scientist, as a planner, construction project supervisor, division chief, and program manager. Basically, if there was a job, he probably did it in the park. All fun jobs, as he said. He spent the last part of his Park Service career working for Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks as a natural resource program manager and a jack of all trades. That often include working with the park's partners in regional and watershed planning. And this is really where he gets into the heart of the research that he's going to be sharing with us here. In his spare time, he spent the last many years researching the Tulare Lake Basin's flood, drought, and water use history. And he even wrote a 500-page book, which I am going to attempt to lift up and show in front of the camera, on this topic, which you can buy from our bookstore at Sequoia Parks Conservancy online. John actually has very graciously donated all the proceeds that he would get as author to the Sequoia Parks Conservancy for that. And he's the sole author of that. John lives in 3 rivers on the South Fork of the Huecker, as do I, so we are river neighbors. And he is determined not to write a 6th book because that is too much pain and suffering, but he is more than happy to come and join us today to talk about his 5th book. John, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us on Giant Conversations.
Thank you. Do I go ahead and share my screen now?
Yes, you may.
I appreciate being coached at every opportunity.
We are all learning this stuff as we go.
Oh, there we go. There, how's that?
To me, it's still showing my background.
Yeah. So So does that mean I did not successfully share?
That's correct. So you go down to that green button down there, it says
Yeah,
share screen. And it
yeah.
might say
And
something about,
when I do, I get 6 different monitor images showing up.
yeah,
Oh, I've got to hit share twice, duh.
yeah. They don't like it.
Okay.
There you go. And now you can
Well,
go into your present mode.
huh, that was more effort than it should have been. That better not take off of my time. One of the things that Daniel didn't mention was that the Sequoia Conservancy helps out by publishing stuff, including my book, which I really appreciate. Although it's got my name on this book, it was very much a community effort. There were literally hundreds of people involved in putting this together. There'll be a few references to it during this talk. You can buy it from the Conservancy. It's also written to be read electronically, so you can just Google the title and it will come up as a free PDF. But we're going to go right straight to stories. Thanks everybody for showing up for this. Here's hoping my voice holds out. We've had a big water year so far this year. Maybe it's done, maybe there's still more. But since the founding of the Valley Towns, there have been about 22 water years that were similar to this. And the first one of those was in 1853. And there was a group of whalers that are nicely positioned to tell the story of that flood. So long before Americans got out here to the West Coast, the whalers were coming around from the Northeast US. And when the gold rush started in 48, then they started coming into San Francisco more. So this is not this particular whale ship, but a whale ship pulled into San Francisco in 1853. And life on a whale ship, by all accounts, was miserable unless you were the captain. And so presumably while the captain was ashore, a group of sailors stole a whale boat, which is the kind of boat that's used to actually go out and harpoon the whale. So a big, heavy, solid boat. And they jumped ship and they wanted to get as far away from there as possible so that they weren't re-imprisoned or however you want to think of the life they were doing. And unbeknownst to me, whale boats like this had sails, and there's a lot of wind up around San Francisco. So they put up a sail which avoids having to do so much manual labor. And they started up the delta as if you were going to Sacramento. There's a light blue triangle on the top, and that's the delta with Sacramento at the top of that, San Francisco over on the left. And as Annie Esperanza used to tell us all the time, the wind comes down from the northwest toward the Tulare Lake Basin, the southern part of that picture, that map. And that's why we get all the smog or the bad air from the Bay Area and from Sacramento. So as they were coming up, and again, this is just sailing. They're not having to work, and there's a big flood going the other way, but it's a snowmelt flood. So although it's high, it's relatively gentle. And when you get to the center of that blue triangle on the top, instead of going north towards Sacramento, which would mean rowing, they followed the wind and came down south on the San Joaquin River. And about halfway down that map, the San Joaquin turns off and goes up into the Sierra. And you see something that today we call the Fresno Slough that leads down into the northern part of Tulare Lake. And all of the river courses that are shown on these maps should be taken with a grain of salt because they've changed multiple times with different floods. Most mappers have chosen to show the rivers the way they are now and the lakes the way they used to be, which is sort of a confusing mess. But these guys were sailing in to the northern part of the lake. They had no idea where they were going. They were just getting away from the captain. And just north of Tulare Lake, you see a river that comes in on the upper right from the northeast, and that's the Kings River, which used to flow directly into the lake. And all four of our rivers in the Tulare Lake Basin, the Kings, the Sequoia, the Tulare, and the Kern, formed big alluvial fans that stuck from the foothills out into the middle of the valley. And that's what the Kings has done. And the rivers would go back and forth from one side to the other. They weren't right down the center of their fan. And the fan that was formed by the Kings, which is just a monstrous big pile of dirt across the valley, is what held back Tulare Lake. So prior to settlement times in 1852 being when Visalia, the first community, was settled, the water from all four rivers would go in to the Tulare Lake bed, which was just a depression, and it would fill up until it reached that high point that was formed by the fan from the Kings River. And that spot where they came in is more or less on the upper right-hand side of this picture. Right in the center, you see this very shiny thing that looks like a mirror, which is an alluvial flat in most years, but that was Summit Lake. And it was called Summit Lake because it sat on the summit of the fan that was formed by the Kings River across there. On the left-hand side, you see the runways for Lemoore Naval Air Station. They were not there in 1853, but Tulare Lake, would have been under Tulare Lake. So the Fresno Slough, the water that was flowing out of Tulare Lake, well, over on the left-hand side where all the farm stuff is shown, went through Summit Lake. It was effectively the last stop before it went over the top of that ridge. And then over on the right down Fresno Slough, onto the San Joaquin and on down. And by good fortune, and those whalers had really good fortune, the water was 9 feet deep when it went over this ridge. So they probably weren't even aware, I'm sure they weren't aware that they were going over a ridge. And they just sailed right into Tulare Lake and kept on sailing. And if you've got 9 feet of water over a dam, not only can you get a big whaleboat in, but you can get anything else that's in the San Joaquin River and go over. So the Tulare Lake was the southernmost salmon run in the US that happened to be Chinook salmon. And there was an anthropologist who interviewed a lot of the Yoket Indians in Tulare Lake bed, and of the many kinds of fish that they harvested, their favorite by far was Chinook. After that was steelhead, and then on down the list. But they lived pretty well there. And if the Chinook could come over in a wet year, then so could everything that ate Chinooks or ate salmon. So in Tulare Lake at the time of settlement, we had sea otters, we had harbor seals, we had sea lions, and the stuff you would expect like beaver and river otters were there as well. So the whaleboats coming in from the upper left, coming down across the Fresno Slough through Summit Lake, which is that little blue pimple on the top of Tulare Lake. I know that's not respectful, but it looks like a pimple. And on through Tulare Lake. And this map shows what the natural communities were like at the gold rush time. So the almost orange color that's through there is wetlands. And there was about 400,000 acres of wetlands. Think of it as a really, really intense cattail marsh from what is now Bakersfield at the bottom of the Grapevine all the way to San Francisco Bay. But that lighter tan color was desert. It was desert in the sense that it couldn't support any significant vegetation, and it was desert in the sense that it got less than 10 inches of rain a year. So the first pioneers who were coming through, or the gold rush seekers, or however you want to think of them, talked in very disparaging terms about the desert that was out there. And later on, we watered the desert, and now it's growing all kinds of crops, but that is not the natural situation. So the sailors sailed, they had no idea what was around at the time. They didn't know that Visalia over to the east had been settled the year before, or that in 1853, it became the county seat of Tulare County. I'm sure they had no idea what the counties even were.
Well, that wasn't supposed to happen.
So they went down through the bottom of that wetland, which is the Kern River, and through Buena Vista Lake. They're pretty much following the course of today's Interstate 5. And where Interstate 5 turns to go back over to 99 is Buena Vista Lake, which is also coming back. Each of these lakes is in a stair-step fashion. So its highest elevation down at the bottom in the Kern Lake, where you come down off of the Grapevine from Los Angeles, and then further down is Buena Vista, and then Tulare Lake as it goes out. When they got down to the bottom to Kern Lake, there was a creek coming in from the side, Tejon Creek. And if you come down from Tejon Pass to the bottom of the Grapevine, that little creek is the creek that the whalers decided to follow in their whaleboat sailing, mind you. There was that much water in the creek at the time. Not that there was that much more rain and snow that year, just we weren't using the rain and snow to irrigate the desert. So it was available as runoff. And they went up the Tejon Creek for a ways to where later the headquarters for Tejon Ranch would be built. And they saw an Indian village, a ranchero, off to the side 1/2 mile. And they lifted their boat up. So there must have been close to 6 of them to lift a boat that heavy, and pulled it over on the side and went over and hung out with the Indians for a couple of weeks. But that's just the official story. These guys almost certainly had not seen any women in a year. So their sole concern, I'm sure, was hanging out with the Indian women. They decided that they were far enough away from San Francisco, they wouldn't be captured and re-imprisoned. So they married, in air quotes, local Indian maidens, lived happily ever after, and they earned their income, or however you want to think of it, by trapping beaver and river otters in the wetland that's there at the base of the Grapevine. When you come off the Grapevine now, it's just hard to imagine that there ever was that kind of condition. Not that there was more water, just that we allowed the water to go where it naturally wanted to go. And as they came across Tulare Lake, there was the newfound community of Visalia. And you can read in the New York Times about what it was like in Visalia in 1853. And it's clear that they had no idea what was going on in Tulare Lake, just like the whalers had no idea what was going on in Visalia. But this was the intersection that Visalia was founded around. And most of us have been there. That's Court Street going left and right. And you're looking down Main towards the national park. The building that's on the far left is the Palace Hotel building that was put up the same year as Custer's Last Stand. It's the oldest still in use commercial building in this part of the San Joaquin Valley. And if you can see just a little further to the left, that's the Starbucks on Main Street. So hold this picture in your mind, and then we'll go back in time. And this is one of the first pictures of Visalia taken at the very same intersection. This was 10 years after the whaleboat story, just because there were more cameras around as you got into the beginning of the Civil War. So you're looking down Main Street, and that building that's on the far left there is what is today Starbucks. In the run-up to the Civil War for 3 years, the Butterfield stage came right down the middle of Main Street there on the run from St. Louis to San Francisco. And if you look to the right past this wagon that has no wheels on it, on the left-hand side of that wagon near the top, you can see a hand pump in the background. And that was the water source for the town of Visalia. Sean and I were just shopping there on the left at the Palace Hotel building a day or two ago. And when you look across the street, there's a backflow preventer right where that was. So we're going to take a break for just a moment now in case there are any questions that need to be answered, so you don't have to hold them till the end.
All right, thank you, John. Going through the questions that we have some that kind of cover further into the future. So do you want to answer those now, or do you want to hold off on them and get going towards?
I would prefer to hold off on those, since they're not particularly relevant to this section. Yeah, I'd be glad to answer anything.
Tell us a little bit more, because I think when you were talking about it, one of the most amazing things is this vision of folks trapping beaver and river otters in as you're coming down the Tahoe Pass. And what was their ecosystem like?
You could either imagine it as being like the Everglades or like the swamps in Louisiana with the Cajuns. You had a river course that sometimes was there, sometimes was not. There were 5 natural lakes which were occupying natural depressions in the lake basin. So they served like water holes on the Serengeti. And then there was enough moisture between those and around those lakes to support big stands of tules that were anywhere from like a 50-foot ring around the lake to maybe a quarter of a mile. And the tules were a form of bulrush, but they were like a bulrush on steroids. So a couple inches in diameter and up to 20 feet tall. The first pioneers, the first people who came through were the fur trappers like Jedediah Smith. But then in 49, when the gold rush seekers came through and they complained about how hard it was to walk through the desert, they found that trying to go through the wetland was even worse. So it was a fine place for beaver and river otters and ducks and herons and grebes and all that, but not for, and for the Native Americans, one of the most dense populations of humans at the time north of Mexico was around Tulare Lake.
One of the other questions in the chat was, when I think of a whaleboat, I think of a giant boat out in the sea. How is the water only 9 feet deep?
So that's 2 questions. Though if I've got my terminology right, the whale ship is the big giant boat out at water, and then they carried whale boats that they lowered off the side, which were big and giant, but only from the standpoint of a rowboat. And it did not pull that much water, if that's the right term. So it probably only needed, I'm guessing, a foot or 2 of water to make it through. After they got ready to leave the Indian village and the sailors went back down to the lakes they'd seen, Buena Vista and Kern, the story is told by one of the Native Americans there of what it was like, that in those 2 weeks, Tejon Creek had gone down, so it was no longer 2 feet out of its banks. And what the sailors did was to turn their boat sideways to the Tejon Creek, sit in it, so it was like a dam. And then after there was enough water, they'd hop out of the sailboat, turn it, and with the help of the Indians, run it downstream a couple of 100 yards till they ran out of water. So it just did not need all that much water.
Another, it's more of a comment, but someone else was saying, were there grizzly bears at the lake?
The grizzly bears were primarily over the valley floor. At the time, there were not that many up in the mountains because the eating was better out on the floor. I don't think they were in the wetlands itself, but they were all around there. And some of the best stories we have of grizzlies from that time were over at Fort Tejon, which you pass when you leave the valley floor and start to climb the Tejon Pass. And the grizzlies would come together in really large herds when it was acorn time. Some of them were described as 300 grizzlies in one herd, just feeding on the oaks in there, on the acorns.
That's amazing. Well, we have some more questions, but I want John, you to keep going on, because there's more to this story still.
And get my book. It's absolutely free, and the answers to all the questions are in there. So it talks about what there's a section that describes the ecosystem around Tulare Lake at the time and just what kind of critters were there who are not there now. Okay, we will go on. So how big was Tulare Lake? That's an arm of Lake Tahoe there. So it was the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi, which is saying something. It was not as big as the Great Salt Lake. And when it was full, it was 4 times larger than Tahoe, which is just mind-boggling to me because it takes so long to go around Tahoe. But it stretched 40 miles from end to end, not counting the rivers on the ends. And this is the elevations of the lake from the time of settlement, 1850 on the left, 2 years before settlement, to 1969 on the right. Any of you who know Mo Basham, she was living down in Corcoran at that time in the floods on the right. And the bottom of the graph, the 179 elevation on the left, is the lowest point in the lake at the time back in the 1850s. Since then, the lake bed has dropped and dropped. And now my understanding is it's 12 feet deeper than the bottom of this graph. And then up at, I don't know, 2.5 bars down from the top, if you can imagine the elevation, 207.5, that was when the lake at the time was full enough that it could just start to go through Summit Lake and over the top of that alluvial fan formed by the Kings. But when there was a lot of water coming out, and you can see 3 big floods there, 1853, 1861, 1867, then it was upwards of 9 feet higher than that low point. So that's why there was enough water to float those guys over. And you, again, my way of grasping Tulare Lake is to think of the Serengeti. So one big flood could lift this 40-mile long lake 15 feet in just 1 year. And then over the subsequent 4, 5, 6 years, it would go down, 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 and maybe there'd be another flood to lift it. This is the record we have of how big the floods were. So we're not really sure what happened in the hundreds of years before that. We don't know whether those 3 big floods that you see on the left are representative of how often they would come, or whether they were just big floods. And they were mostly snowmelt floods, all 3 of those. As you get over, I don't know, 30 bars to the right, you can see where we finally have the last flood that reaches 207.5 feet. And from there down until the lake goes dry, only took 20 years. And that was because starting in 1855, these farmers who came out from the east to go gold mining and didn't strike it rich came back down and started irrigating the desert, grabbing the water out of the 4 big rivers. And they probably made far more money that way than they would have if they'd stayed up in the gold mines. When it first hits dry there at the end of the 1890s, there's an obituary written in a San Francisco newspaper that talks about what the heck happened. Where did the lake go? And then it came back to just a shallow depth, 3, 4, 5 feet for the next few years. And you see in 1905, where there's just almost no water, just a foot or so in the lake. And that's when Corcoran was founded. And the guy who founded it had founded many other towns. He was a land speculator. And you can read in things like the New York Times where it was thought that the lake could never come back again. And then 1906, this enormous flood came down, the biggest snowpack that the park has ever seen in historic times, and just drowned everybody down there. And then it goes dry again. There's a mega drought that's there just before the Dust Bowl hit in the Midwest. We had our own period of dry years. And then there's a good bit of water during the 1940s, and it goes dry again. And it just keeps coming back and going dry through there. So that was the elevation of the lake. This is looking at it from the standpoint of how big it was. The 700 miles that you see on the right was, or the third one from the left, was the last time that it was up to the elevation of Summit Lake where it could flow through. The 2 on the, and when people ask how big was the lake, it was all over the place. If you fill it up till it's brim full, it was roughly 700 square miles. If you fill it up to as much water as anybody ever saw there, it was roughly 790 square miles. And then it went down, and during during 1906, when that big flood came back and clobbered Corcoran, and all the farmers who were down there in the lake bed, who thought that they had an easy life of it, it came back to 300 miles. And then in 1943, in the World War II years, 156, and then it's been lower since then. The last two, well, when you look at pictures from 69 or 83, it is a ginormous lake. Sylvia Haltane and Bill Tweed said that they could see the lake from up at Beetle Rock in 1983. And that is just a big lake. In 1998 was when I came out right after the 97 flood, and it was just a little piddly thing of 50 miles, but that's still big for a lake. And Huell Hauser did a program on the lake in that year, in which he's standing out in the lake going, where the heck did this come from? Because again and again and again, we forget that lake is right there. Sean and I went down to the lake a couple of weeks ago, and it was roughly 78 square miles at the time. And it's grown since then. There is speculation that it might get up to the range of 156 later this year. There's no way to know, but it could rival what happened in 69, 83. And I guess I should have covered one more thing here. And that is, when Corcoran was built, it was put in at an elevation of 207 feet, which should keep it out of the floods. But parts of Corcoran are down at 174 feet from what I've heard, which means 5 feet below the floor of the lake bed at this time. So it's hard to know how big of a levee you have to build around Corcoran to protect it. In 69, the Corps of Engineers came in and built a levee that I think was 192 feet high. So you can see that'd be 2.5 bars up from the bottom to protect it. It just barely did. And then they had to come back in 83 and rebuild the levee. And as the floor of the lake bed, which means all of Corcoran, has dropped and dropped, the levee has had to be raised multiple times to get it back up. It's currently sitting at 188 feet, and they're spending upwards of $20 million to try to get it back close to that 192-foot level before the runoff gets down there. So it's an interesting time in Corcoran. I've got 3 pictures here that just give a sense of what the lake's been like in different times. During World War II, thanks to Tony Caprio, and if you get my book, there's a huge acknowledgement section there for all the different people like Rob Hansen and Terry Ullman and Tony, and just so many people at the park, and just the whole community that came together to write this book. But Tony knew that there had been a seaplane operation down Tulare Lake, and it was enough of an operation. The Navy actually wound up leasing land down there and had the 2 biggest seaplanes that the government had, that the military had, landed there. They were training the pilots out of Alameda up at Oakland, and at night, the women, Navy waves, would take the guys out flying across the Pacific to teach them how to navigate by the stars. And then at sunrise, they'd come back into Alameda. Alameda, like San Francisco, was often shrouded in fog and they couldn't land. So they would come down to Tulare Lake and sit on the lake and wait until the fog burned off in San Francisco and then go up there. So that's World War II. And then this is a picture, this actually is a picture of Tulare Lake after 69. And there are many wonderful stories in that flood book. And one of them is the one Mo Basham tells of being a young girl growing up here and how her dad would gather up all the neighborhood kids, put them in the back of a pickup, no seatbelt, take them out to the edge of where the lake was at the time and teach them how to catch crawdads, crayfish, whatever, and bring them back for a big feast in Corcoran. And that lake lasted for a good while in the 60s. And then this was 2 Well, this was, yeah, almost 2 weeks ago. I think this is on the, if you've ever been west of Corcoran, which isn't much of a fun drive, you just go out there half a dozen miles and you would normally be right in the middle of Boswell's cotton fields. But right now, this is the view looking towards the setting sun at the Coast Range and getting wetter all the time. Another way to look at what's happening this year is to look at the amount of snowfall, not the snowpack, but measuring up the amount of snow year to year. And we have data from 4 different years stacked from bottom to top with how big the different years were as you go from the beginning of our winter or whatever it's called in September through to when the melt happens in June. What's not shown on here is the current year. We don't really know what's happening, but also the Lodgepole Weather Station, which for 70 years had collected snow data, no longer does that. So we don't have that information anymore. And also not shown on here is before we had a lodgepole up there collecting that data was the winter of 1905, 1906. And that turned out to be far and away the biggest snow winter that the park has had, or that the Southern Sierra has had. And it was, the USGS did a study and found that it was 38% greater than the 1951-52 winter, which is the next to the top one. So imagine all those bars stacked together and then go a third higher. And that's what it was in 1906. Charlie Blossom, for whom Blossom Peak was named here, was one of the rangers who worked under the cavalry out of the Presidio. And he kept a diary that year. And in June, he went down to Lemon Cove, met the train down there, got a load of trout fry, put them on his horse or mule, his pack mule, and took them up to Huecker Lake and came back, apparently all in one day, which is just a heck of a horse ride. And he said that half of the route from what we think of as South Fork Campground to Huecker Lake was over packed snow that was 5 feet or more deep. And that was in June. And that is a heck of the snowpack. In Giant Forest in June, it was still 12 feet deep from the previous winter. So we have 2 kinds of floods. We have rain floods, which are the big spectacular ones that John Muir described that hit in a hurry and then they're gone in a hurry. And then we have snowmelt floods that can be bigger, but they're stretched out over a month or so and they're much gentler, but they're delivering a lot of water down to the bottom. And the last 3 of these, I think, nope, I don't want to make a guess on that. I think it was 2011, 2017, and this year. So we're still getting them quite regularly. Here's oops, I left out 2019. So here's a list of what I think of as the 22 biggest runoff years since the time of settlement. And the right-hand column shows what the way it used to be measured, which was how much water's coming into the lake. And then as we started getting gauging stations on the rivers, gauging stations that wouldn't be washed out in big floods, then you see the middle column. And all of these are runoff years where we had 5 million acre feet or more, which is a lot of water. For comparison, our average runoff for our 4 rivers and the streams that are around here is 2.9. So all of these are twice as big as what our average is. And the one on the bottom is not much more than a guesstimate right now. Who knows just how big the runoff is going to be this year. But it's in good company with some of those others. And you can see 1983 there at 8.7 million acre feet was a big year. The Department of Water Resources takes the results of 4 of their weather stations in the San Joaquin Basin, with that's everything that's south of the Delta, and uses those as an index of what's going on. So you can compare it from year to year. And the left hand, you can think of this as a giant water rain gauge. The left-hand side is October 1, which is when our water year starts, and then October 1 on the right. And the blue, the shaded blue in the middle is what the average amount of, in an index sense, the average amount that we get. So you can see spring builds up pretty fast, and then it flattens off for June, July, and August. Down at the bottom are some of the really, really dry years we've had. Up at the top, you can see 1983 is the record-setting year, but 2017, which was just yesterday, was nearly as big as 1983. And then if you drop down to our current year, that's the dark blue line, third from the top, you can see that for a while there, we were climbing as fast as 1983 for a brief period, and then the rain slowed down, and then they stopped, compared to 83 and 2017, where you had a good bit of precipitation in April. So unless something turns around and we start getting a lot of rain, which is not going to happen, we're going to come in well below what 2017 was, but a good bit above 2019. And all of this is just way above average. And we just recently had what I think was the retirement party for Nate Stevenson. And one of the many things that Nate taught me was that just because we have data on runoff from the stream gauges doesn't mean that it's reflection of precipitation. They are not one and the same. But it happens that because the park is so rugged, we have terrible precipitation weather station data for that. So we go with what we have. And this takes all of the water that falls in the Tulare Lake Basin naturally. And the Tulare Lake Basin is from the top of the Sierra to the top of the first of the Coast Ranges, from Tejon Pass on top of the Tehachapies to Lemoore Naval Air Station. And of all of that, you've got the orange in the upper left, which is runoff that typically gets through the canals that we see down lower. You've got the green that soaks into the ground, forget the purple. And then the blue is all the precipitation that lands up in the park and never makes it down as runoff. So when those previous graphs that you saw that were mapping runoff, they're just mapping the orange part. And the rest can fluctuate all over the place. So just because charts look like they speak God's truth doesn't mean they necessarily do. This is looking at runoff from the time that the folks back on the East Coast made everybody standardized to all the weather stations to collect data the same way in 1894. And what this does is to stack up the runoff from our four big rivers. So the Kings, which is the biggest, is on the bottom. And then you have the the Kern on top of that as orange or sienna or something. And then the blue is the Kauai, and that little black speck on the top is the Tule. And as you go across from left to right, you can see in the 1970s, where we had the two driest years that California has ever experienced, you can see 2.9 million, just below that 3 million line, is what our average runoff is. And so most of our years are significantly below average. As Tweed used to lecture us, we do not get average here. We do not get normal here. It's just a statistical fluke. And then in with all this, you get these occasional years of just heavy runoff. So that's 69 and 83 are the two that go so high. And on the right-hand side is an estimate of what this year might turn out to be. But those big years of 69 and 83 are just phenomenal. And 69 didn't totally clobber us because there was a relatively dry year before that. But what happened in 83 was you had several wet years, including 82, that were already getting a lot of water down into the lake. And then the record-setting year on top of that is what drowned everybody. If you look at the long term, going back 1,000, 1,100 years, this kind of pattern just repeats itself over and over. There's no trend going up, no trend going down until you hit the mid-1980s. And then based on that relatively short time of whatever that is, 45 years or so, it's been going down. The amount of precipitation we get on average has been going down. And that's primarily because of that ridge of high pressure that's been forming off of California that stops the storm tracks from Hawaii getting down our way. But we won't talk droughts. And this graph is essentially the table of contents of my book, just turned into a graph. So above the 0 line is the number of floods in any given year, not how bad they were, not how anything else, just how many there were. So in 1983, there were 11 different floods that year. And then below the 0 line is whether there was a drought that year. And you can see that we get floods in the middle of droughts. We just get floods at all kinds of times. And the rightmost line is saying we're looking at 3 floods for this year. Excuse me. So that was the one in something like January 10th, early March, and mid-March. Okay, finally, another break. Any questions?
Thank you, John. Sorry, I was clicking the wrong button there. You threw a lot of information at us in terms of statistics and graphs, and I really appreciate that because I think a lot of times we're so in the moment in our own particular year that it's hard for us to remember how things were last year, let alone 10 years, 20 years, 50 years ago. So I really appreciate you showing those numbers. We do have an opportunity to ask John questions. All of you are muted and we can't see your video, but you can type questions into the Q&A session if you're joining us by Zoom, or if you're with us on Facebook, you can type it into the chat comment section there. So I'm going to share a couple of them, but John, we've got quite a few, so you're going to have to be a little bit brief in your answer.
Oh, darn. Okay.
Or else the flood will gone by the time we finish this. So one of the questions, though, was from someone named Lou, a question from a Southern California foreigner. Were Lake Cahuilla and Pine Flat really built to save Visalia and Fresno from flood, or were they really just a way to expand agricultural acreage in the Central Valley?
So all 4 of our federal reservoirs, we have 4 rivers, 4 reservoirs. All of them were funded by the federal government in large part. They were all multi-purpose dams. So they both, during the wintertime, they protect the communities down below. During the summertime, they provide water for the farming interests down below. And the politics of getting those built, each one had its own complex history of how to do it. But for the one on Lake Cahuilla and the one on the Tulare, the congressman from this area who got those through used the big flood of 55 to motivate Congress to fund them.
All right, thank you. Another question from Bruce is, in '83, he remembers going fishing in Tulare Lake and caught quite a few white bass. Where did these fish come from, and will they be back this time? So in my book, it tells the history of where the fish came from. There were 3 or 4 species that, or maybe a half dozen, maybe way more than that were native. But after people started settling this area, they brought in their favorite fish and introduced them down there. So we had white bass, we had catfish, and all kinds of things. Will they show up again then? If there's water there and there's a source, this should be directed to Danny Boyano, then those fish will come back in. But a lot of those fish, there is no connection from where, like the Chinook salmon and the steelhead are, to the lake. So they won't make it back in. Great, thank you. Another question is from Alan. He says, the course of the Kern through Buena Vista to Tulare Lake, was there a divide to cross, or was there a cut for water to flow through? How did those connect? The midpoint of the valley, more or less halfway between I-5 and 99, is the lowest elevation. And so when the Kern came out at the south end of the Tulare Lake Basin, it's downhill from there to San Francisco. So it just found the lowest course, like a crease through the middle of the valley. Okay. And we have another question from Melanie, would you explain why the floor of the lake bed has dropped over time? Simple question, right?
That is not part of this talk, but what happens is the farmers who came here, and I grew up on a farm, farmers are capitalists. The more water you have, especially in a desert, the more money you make. So they have tapped into every source of water they can, including overdrafting the aquifer that's below us, the water that was built up over literally tens of thousands of years. And as that water has been pumped out from underneath in spots, the ground is collapsed above that and is collapsing now in spots at a rate of a foot or more a year.
Thank you. And another question is, well, I'll give you two pieces of the same question. One question is, why is snow no longer being measured at Lodgepole? And the other is, it'd be good to know how much snow is still up in Sequoia and Kings Canyon now. It's an estimated time of when most of it will melt. So talk a little bit more about the snowpack.
So I was dumbstruck a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, when I found out that Lodgepole is no longer measuring snow. I was not able to determine why that was, but the speculation was that there was a shortage of funds for doing that kind of stuff. And I have not been able to get up to Lodgepole to see myself. So you need to ask some park person how much snow is up there.
All right. Do you have any data or information that pulls in fires per year in relation to the floods and the droughts? Have you ever looked at fires, floods, and droughts all together? I've done it crude, not like real fire ecologists do it, but there is a section in my book that looks at the biggest fires and how they relate to drought years. And there is some correlation, or so it seems. But as far as I know, fires are not particularly tied in with precipitation. Certainly the stuff we got every single year from the fire folks was, it's been a dry winter, so we're going to have a lot of fires. It's been a wet winter, so we're going to have a lot of fires. Fire seems to be driven a lot. John Keeley could answer that question, but fires are driven in large part by the amount of biomass that's out there, fuel ready to burn. Okay, that seems like that would make a good connection. I just wanted to elaborate in some of the question and answer. Somebody pointed out that California Department of Fish poisoned every fish in Lake Huecker with rotenone to eradicate white bass, which was feared to spread into the San Joaquin and threaten rare species, which certainly is a concern if you're talking about fish moving from one area into another where they shouldn't normally be.
Right, and if you get the free PDF of my book and search for white bass or for rotenone, it'll tell you the whole story of what went on, how they got there, and what was done to get rid of them.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we've got some people in the chat that are experts in this area talking about it. So one of the things to let everybody know is that John has very graciously shared his whole presentation with us. And so those of you that have registered with us through the Eventbrite, we have your email, and we will send out a follow-up email where we're going to send you John's entire presentation, this recording, if you want to share it with anyone else. And John will also give us the link to his book where you can download it for free. And we'll also provide you the link to our bookstore where you can buy it for a price.
And two things to add to that. One is, if I can remember either one of them, oh darn, the shame of not having a memory, is that I am not going to provide you the link to my book. All you got to do is Google the title and it will hit. And the other one, I have no idea what it was. But whatever Daniel just said, I'm sure wasn't true.
Oh, yes. You won't give me the link, but it's easy to find where you can download it.
Yeah, but there was something else in there.
Yeah, the other point is that your book is available at all our bookstores in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park, as well as our online bookstore.
Absolutely.
Right. We're going to keep.
The Conservancy was very gracious in printing this book, and they wanted to get into science education as opposed to some of the stuff they were doing before, which I appreciate because I needed a publisher.
Great. Well, John, you actually still have a little bit more to share. So I want to let you continue on and finish with your last section of the presentation.
Oh, I know what it is. When you get the copy of the presentation, it has not just the pictures that are shown from the PowerPoint, but the speaker notes about what I would have said if I'd had time enough to say it for each one of those. So there you'll get all the statistics.
Okay.
So we've heard a lot about atmospheric rivers. They've only been known for 20 years or so, but that's where roughly half of our precipitation and most of our most serious storms come from. They can be thought of vaguely like the eye wall of a hurricane. As a cyclonic storm breaks apart, that energy pulls the water in from out by Hawaii, and we've gotten hit with a number of those this year. This is an example of an atmospheric river. The next couple, 3 pictures are from Tony Caprio, who has just a wonderful series of pictures of the Kauai at the Gateway restaurant there, the Pumpkin Hollow Bridge. So the 97 flood was a typical high-rise flood like this, where this is showing how fast the elevation is going up, the cubic feet per second, the flow. And during that point, when it was rising up to the peak at midnight, because all the best floods happen in the middle of the night, Lake Kauai was rising 5 feet an hour during that. So the Corps was having to hustle to get things out of the way of this coming deluge. And then it just calms down, and that's the way our rain floods go. They hit and they're gone in one day. This is the March 10th flood, another Tony Caprio picture looking at the Gateway. These floods have taken out the abutments of that bridge. I think it was 3 different times, and each time Caltrans thinks this time we'll stop it. But you can, the January flood was black across there from all the carbon from the previous big fire of the KNP complex. But the Kauai is the steepest river in all 50 states, and it carries 4.5 times more sediment, partly because it's the steepest, of any river measured in the entire Sierra. All of that sediment is going down to Lake Kauai and being deposited there, greatly reduced the capacity of that reservoir to catch future floods. Shauna and I, she lived at Buckeye Housing just to the left of this picture, and we stopped there in a flood in 2002 and smelled it, and it smelled like the Kansas that I had just come from. There was an amazing amount of sediment that goes down there. This is the flood recurrence intervals for just some of the better known or more recent floods. And it's lined up with all 4 of our rivers north to south. So you can see the 1955 and 66 floods were roughly 100-year floods, but it depended on what river you were on. So like the 66 flood that was so big was only a 70-year flood on the Kings, but was a 333-year flood on the Kern. And then you drop down to the 3 floods that we had this year, January, March 10th, March 15th. And on the Kauai, the January flood was an 8-year flood, which compares to the 1997 flood, the last big one, if you will, that we've had. So January was smaller. The March 10th flood was bigger, and then roughly the same for March 15th. And as Eric Myers pointed out in the really nice piece that he put together, there are different ways you can measure what the flood interval is. You can measure it as how uncommon is that peak, how uncommon is the peak hour, how uncommon is the peak day, and this is based on peak days. So this is just looking at 4 of the biggest ones that we've had come down here. The 1861-62 flood was just absolutely phenomenal. Essentially every stream and river from Mexico all the way to the Columbia River flooded. And on many or most of those, that is still the flood of record, the biggest they've ever had. It was enormous. It was very near biblical. And then there was a big drought in between that was just a horrendous drought that, if anything, did more damage than the flood. And then for our four rivers, Kings, Kaweah, Tule, and Curran, the 1867-68 flood was bigger than that. And that 67-68 flood wasn't like those rain floods you saw before. It was 40 days and nights of precipitation that soaked deeper and deeper and deeper into the soil. And then in a 9-day period, right at the peak of the biggest floods we've ever seen, there were enormous landslides that came down off of the Sierra. And we could do the whole talk just on that one. Then 1955, there was something like an 85-year gap in which people forgot just how big floods were. And then 55 came along and clobbered Visalia, just really smashed them good, which is how we got 2 more reservoirs out of it. And then in 66, we had another flood, which was essentially the same thing as the 55. It was right at the same height, and again, was just spectacular. And then there was virtually nothing, well, that there has been nothing of that magnitude since. We've had just this year, we finally got a 28-year flood, but otherwise we haven't had a 50-year flood since 1966. And this is looking at that 1861-62 flood. The white area that you see is how much of the state was underwater at one time. So when you came off of the Grapevine down to the valley floor, there was a lake there 20 to 60 miles wide and 400 miles long that extended all the way to Redding. It took out a quarter of the real property value of California just in that one storm. And when the flood planning agencies tell us to get ready for a big flood, this is the one they point to, because even without climate change making things worse, this is what we can expect to come back. And by good chance, Mary Andrade saved this one-of-a-kind document that the Corps of Engineers had done, which was saying that if Terminus Dam, which is over on the right-hand side, just off of the map, if Terminus Dam was working, and the diagonal line on the left is Highway 99, Visalia is in the south center, or the lower center of this map. This is how much of northwestern Tulare County would be underwater. That's a lot of water. And you can think of this standard project flood as being basically a recurrence of the 1861 or the 1867 flood. So when the big flood hits, don't go down to Visalia. And I believe that's the end of the talk right there. Yes, it is. So more questions.
All right, thank you so much, John. I mean, I think that last slide there is really impressive and sort of reminding us where things were. Even though I personally have a very close hope for the return of Tulare Lake, I realize that there's a lot of other people that would significantly impact in a lot more negative ways. But the descriptions from your book of what Tulare Lake was with the wildlife and the tules and the amount of birds that were just flying through over there, it's really incredible to kind of think about that.
Or the amount of birds that regularly were flying through the park because of Tulare Lake and all those wetlands. It's hard to remember now, but for 3 seasons of the year, fall, winter, and spring, the park was just loaded with waterfowl, with rails, with herons, with all kinds of things that are not there now because Tulare Lake's not there.
I think I heard somebody talk about with the return of the Tulare Lake, are some of these birds coming back through, or are you seeing new species that normally you wouldn't see in that area?
Shauna and I just snuck in to take a look. We didn't take time to look for birds, but where we were not seeing that much in the way of bird life. But Rob Hansen's descriptions from the past is whenever the water returns, birds return. There are not as many birds as before, but lots and lots of birds.
All right. For those of you that are joining us, we're not able to hear or to see you, but you can put your questions for John into the chat. I know we're getting towards the end of our time here, but I did want to give everyone a chance to ask any final questions before we wrap this up. There
was a question from early on that I booted to the end of this that was
right.
looking into the future.
Well, and essentially it was actually about the future whenever there were going to be dams. And so you answered a little bit of the question.
Oh, okay.
Dams. But do you want to talk about the future? Do you have a crystal ball in there?
No, but I'd be glad to come back to do a talk about climate change in the future.
All right, thank you. I think that we have a lot of other topics here. So I'm just scanning through the questions here. And okay, there's another one from Ken. How can there be an 85-year flood above the dam and a 170-year flood below the dam? I'm not sure exactly.
That is probably referring to, I think, the 66 flood, if I remember right. And I'm not sure I'm not sure I understand the question, so I'm not sure I'm answering it right. But in Three Rivers, the 55 and 66 flood were the same. And by chance, really remarkably good luck, Lake Cahuilla was able to capture most of that water and hold it back. But Dry Creek, which is the little creek that goes from the base of Terminus Dam up to Badger and over to Highway 180, that creek was carrying something like half again more water than the Merced River in that famous 97 flood that did so much damage in Yosemite. And so that's what really enlarged the size of the Cahuilla River, is that, and it did virtually no damage. The roads department for the county just closed off the road up at the Mountain House Burger Place and down at Dry Creek or at 198, and just let the logs and stuff roll down by, is it Homer Ranch? That's there by the Dry Creek Preserve.
Yep.
That area.
Sequoia Riverlands Trust operates that one. And it's you can go visit there, Dry Creek too. Another question is, was the 1868 New Year's flood the largest flow on the Kern River? It's a very specific question.
But my book will tell you whether it is or not. I don't remember. But yeah, I'm sure it was, because it was the largest on all four of the rivers. And all four of the rivers relocated in the 1861 flood, and then they relocated again in the 1867-68 flood.
Thank you. Stuart's asking, there was once a regular boat traffic between Visalia and San Francisco. Do you know the route that it took?
So my book tells the story. All the answers are, just look it up in my book. But my book tells the story of the times that people were able to get a boat either from Bakersfield, Visalia, down to San Francisco or back the other way. But there was never any regular transportation going back and forth. It was always a one-off to be able to get through there.
So whenever it was available, people took advantage of the opportunity, because otherwise they were on horse or foot.
Yes, or you could bring your boat up into San Joaquin, and then you had to put it on wagons to haul it around to Tulare Lake.
Oh,
and there was a fairly famous steamship that came up to the San Joaquin. They picked up vaqueros as their pilots to get them through to Tulare Lake, and they were going the right way, and they went to sleep late at night, and when they woke up the next morning, the flood had gone down and the steamboat was up high and dry out there on the dusty plains next to the Butterfield stage for subsequent years. So you had to really time it right to get through.
All right, we are actually past our time, and I really appreciate John answering many of these questions, and even the ones where it's like, read my book. We will provide you with the tools to do that, because it is actually filled with a lot of information that he wasn't able to get to here. just some procedural questions that I saw from the group. How often do we do these conversations meetings? They're intermittently scheduled, but we do have one scheduled for next month. And that is something that I want to make sure that everybody knows about. And so with the Giant Conversations series, our next scheduled one is on the Pacific Fisher, and that is with wildlife biologist Dr. Rebecca Green. She also works for Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, and the Pacific Fisher is a really wonderful, interesting, cute, and important animal that I think all of us would do better learning about. And so we're going to be talking with Rebecca Green, and you will, in the email that we're going to be sending out, you'll have a link where you can sign up for this next discussion that we're going to have. And that's going to be on June 15th, another Thursday at 6 p.m. Once again, I want to thank all of you for coming. This was put on by Sequoia Parks Conservancy. We are the official nonprofit partner of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers at Lake Huecker. And so we are here to support our park partners and the Army Corps and all of the things that they need, and especially communicating with you, the public. So we appreciate all you giving us your time. We are going to send out an email that is going to include a link to John's resources that he referred, as well as a recording of this webinar. We're also going to include some other resources that we think might be interesting to you, and a way that you can donate to Sequoia Parks Conservancy. And our work will then feed into the work that the park is doing and that the Army Corps of Engineers are doing in Lake Huecker. And so this particular one, the link will connect you with the Army Corps of Engineers at Lake Huecker. So again, we encourage you to join us for that. And John, I don't know what to say, except thank you so much. This was, he agreed to do this, and somehow he had the vision, back, what was it when you first started working on this book in 20 years ago?
It seems that way. I had no idea it was going to be a book. I do want to comment that one of the things in chat was that apparently both editions of my book are available as a PDF online. I didn't realize that. But the second edition is the more recent edition.
And also in the chat, it's pointed out that not all of the Sequoia Parks Conservancy bookstores carry the book on the shelf itself. So the safest way, if you want to buy the book, is to go to the Sequoia Parks Conservancy web store, which is store.sequoiaparksconservancy.org. There, I did my little plug for Debbie. Thank you again for all of you doing this. John, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate your knowledge and sharing it all with us. And we look forward to continuing this conversation with you in the future. I think that there's certainly more to share, and we might get back to that other half of the book where we're talking about the droughts someday. For all of us at Sequoia Parks Conservancy, especially all the staff behind the scenes that made this happen, and especially the executive director, Savannah, she was the one that originally suggested this topic. Thanks to all of you that have been helping us out. I want to give one more shout out. Thanks to my dad. It's his birthday today. And so thanks so much for bringing me into the world so I can host this. Thanks, everyone. Excellent. And take care.